Welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Theological Seminary's podcasts on church history. John Calvin considered Bernard of Clairvaux one of the most significant men between the time of Gregory the Great and the Reformation. Significant in the sense that Bernard taught, so Calvin believed, sola fide and the imputation of Christ's righteousness. Calvin actually quotes Bernard 48 times in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. He quotes from 11 different sources, though the bulk of the quotations, I think 24 of them, are from Bernard's renowned sermons on the Song of Songs. Martin Luther called him Sanctus Bernhardus, St. Bernard, which is striking because of Luther's views on the priesthood of all believers. Bernard was born near Dijon in Burgundy in the year 1090. His parents seemingly were models of Christian virtue, but it was his mother who exerted the greatest Christian influence on Bernard, much like Monica exerted on Augustine so many years before. And it was her death in 1107 that marked for Bernard the beginning of his, as he says himself, his long path to complete conversion. Bernard joined the small new community called the Cistercians, and he began practicing lifelong ascetic disciplines, strict fasting, sleep deprivation, which impaired his health throughout the rest of his life. There were times he would even throw himself into icy, cold lakes in order to kill the passions of the flesh. Within 3 years of joining the Cistercian order, he was appointed abbot of the third Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux. And he was a strict disciplinarian, and he had little time for monks who wanted to relax his standards. But at the same time, Bernard showed a growing spiritual wisdom. For example, regarding the danger of spiritual pride, he said, "There are people who go clad in tunics and have nothing to do with furs, who nevertheless are lacking in humility. Surely humility in furs is better than pride in tunics." As the Cistercian order grew, so did Bernard's influence and responsibilities. He always longed to return to a life of solitude. For a brief time in his earlier days, he had been a hermit, but throughout the remainder of his time, he was thrust into the public gaze. When the influential and controversial Paris theologian Peter Abelard wrote, "It is by doubting that we come to inquire, and by inquiring that we reach truth," and suggested that Christ did not pay the penalty but merely to demonstrate Christ's love, Bernard was scandalized. In 1139, he wrote a lengthy letter to the Pope refuting Abelard. He called the Parisian a son of perdition, who disdains and scoffs the death of Christ. Bernard continued, "I was made a sinner by deriving my being from Adam. I am made just by being washed in the blood of Christ, and not by Christ's words and example." You could imagine how endearing that would have been to the reformers. Abelard's teaching was condemned, and he was forced to retire to a monastery. One of the saddest episodes in Bernard's life was when he was commissioned by Pope Eugenius III to travel widely and to encourage men to go on the Second Crusade. And Bernard did so. He travelled widely and he enlisted men into what he called the cause of Christ. In one sermon he pleaded, "I ask you and advise you not to want to put your own business before the business of Christ." And that was a significant blot on Bernard's life. But he was a man of his times. It's very easy at a distance to criticise. We are men and women of our times. And no doubt, if the Lord tarries, in subsequent centuries, people will look back at us and shake their head and wonder how we could be so perhaps complacent in the face of such enormous issues as, for example, abortion or euthanasia. We're all men and women of our times. The crusade was a disaster, and Bernard's reputation suffered during the last 4 years of his life. And yet, a little over 20 years after his death, he was esteemed enough by the church to be canonised. What Bernard is remembered best for today is not his reforming zeal and crusade preaching, but rather his mystical writings. His best known work is On Loving God, in which he states his purpose right at the beginning. "You wish me to tell you why and how God should be loved. My answer is that God himself is the reason he is to be loved." His other enduring literary legacy is his sermons on the Song of Songs, 86 sermons on the spiritual life that actually only touch tangentially on the biblical text. One passage in particular speaks very powerfully to Bernard's lifelong passion to know God. Listen to this. "There are some who long to know for the sole purpose of knowing, and that is shameful curiosity. Others who long to know in order to become known, and that is shameful vanity. There are others still who long for knowledge in order to sell its fruits for money or honours, and this is shameful profiteering. Others again who long to know in order to be of service, and this is charity. Finally, there are those who long to know in order to benefit themselves, and this is prudence." From the 12th century on, two streams of thought dominated medieval theology and medieval church life, namely scholasticism and mysticism. Anselm and later Thomas Aquinas stood as representatives of the scholastic tradition, and Bernard was at the very centre of what has been called the mystical tradition. Now, mysticism is best seen, I think, as a continuum. On one side are extreme examples full of writings of fanciful and ethereal visions. On the other are much milder examples, and Bernard belongs to the milder camp. Bernard really was a monastic theologian, and that implied for him that reality and meaning are found actually in the spiritual, that contemplation trumps intellectual dispute, that experience trumps understanding. Two Latin sayings, I think, highlight the difference between scholasticism and mysticism, although it can be overdrawn. The scholastics declared credo ut intelligam, I believe in order to understand. Bernard favoured credo ut experiar, I believe that I may experience. Now, these distinctions should not be overdrawn. Anselm certainly had his share of contemplation, often breaking into prayer in his philosophical writings. And Bernard appreciated the value of logic and reason. But there were these different emphases. Like the scholastics, Bernard appreciated the limits of experience, appreciating the limits of experience, kept his feet firmly grounded in the written revelation of God. In his sermons on conversion, he sounds really what is a delightful note in the opening few sentences. Blessed are they who hear the word of God. And on loving God, he reminds us that we love God only because he first loved us. And Bernard wrote, God deserves to be loved very much, yea, boundlessly, because he loved us first. He, infinite and we nothing, loved us, miserable sinners, with a love so great and so free. Perhaps it is little wonder that the Reformers looked to Bernard as someone who proclaimed, who taught, and who lived gospel truth.